Origin Chance, Homo Rex, and this is Europe the First Crusade, Man of Iron, Extra Part 4 by the channel Extra Credits. Yeah, one of the best series I reacted from this channel, I guess, because how fucking funny that is, right? But this is a real world event, First Crusade, and yet all the chaos, all the stupidity that it has, I've never come across anything like that. And, especially thinking that, I always thought of Crusades as this kind of a, like I've said in the past, like this, veteran soldiers with steel plate armors basically trying to take over Jerusalem or something. No, it's not that. First of all, it was a clusterfuck that how people basically just marched up with their pitchforks or whatever, all the farmers and shit, and basically killed their own, Christian towns just to survive. And when they got there, it was just, chaos. Then the, soldiers came, which was a bit tame, right? The guy from the Flanders, that area, he was more professional than any other of them, I guess. So it was better than how the people were, because they are soldiers. But even that was chaotic, right? And now they are going to try and take Jerusalem here, but knowing that how there are different armies and no one singular guy who's leading them, I bet that's gonna cause issues, right? I said that in the previous video. I bet that's going to create chaos, because in the battlefield, if you don't have one guy who everybody trusts and wants to follow, that's going to be an issue. So yeah, I don't know how successful this First Crusade is going to be, right? I have no idea about this. But yeah, so far it has been clusterfuck. Some people in the comments said that this was kind of successful. So I guess they are going to take Jerusalem. But if they are going to do that, how are there other crusades? What? Muslims take over Jerusalem again, and again crusade happens? Because there are multiple crusades, not just this one. So yeah, let's watch this one.
And so, at last, the Crusade sailed across the Bosphorus. All 5 of the crusading armies and the remnants of the Peasants' Crusade joining into one massive force to retake the Holy Land. The Crusaders finally passed out.
Oh, there are some peasants still there, alright.
Out of Christian territory. They weren't on Allied ground anymore. For once, any damage they did would actually be to the enemy they were summoned to fight. The First Crusade really had begun. But as the ships crossed the Bosphorus and disgorged their cargo of men in mail and plate, of giant destriers barded for war, of crossbowmen counting their quarrels, they were met with a silent, empty plain. One after another, the Crusader forces arrived, and they waited. Anatolia was quiet. Too quiet. No Turkish horde came to sweep them back into the Bosphorus. No Saracen riders came to pour waves of arrows down on their crusading band. And so the princes met, discussed, and decided that they would move their forces to Nicaea, a few days' march away, with Godfrey de Bouillon at the head of the band. Nicaea was an important city. It was strategically important. It held the road to Jerusalem. If they couldn't take it, they'd have to march a much more difficult path with an incredible enemy stronghold at their back. Nicaea was also symbolically important. The First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Nicaea, had once been called there by the Emperor Constantine himself to determine what was orthodox for the Christian world. And it was politically important. When Kilij Arslan took over the Sultanate of Rome, he took Nicaea for his capital. It housed the royal
He said about Constantine, and I just thought of it like during the Roman times, right? Constantine, the emperor, basically the Chad guy, right? Badass, basically kicked everybody's ass and actually kickstarted, at large scale at least, this Christian movement. And now all this small Christian empire squabbling over things, all the peasant civilians trying to take over Jerusalem. I mean, how different this is from those times, right? I mean, they were looking at the, Saint Constantine and thinking, oh, we are going to take over places. We are going to do what Constantine did. But you are not even come close to that, right? I mean, you are not even a shell of that. Compared to Constantine's Roman Empire, you are nothing. You're all just squabbling over killing your own people. What the fuck?
Treasury and the family of the Sultan. So the crusading forces marched on Nicaea. Godfrey and Bohemond and Tancred arrived first, followed by Raymond and Robert of Flanders. One by one, they set up the siege. And still, nothing happened. Still no Turks. This was getting weird. So, in the eerie quiet, the Crusader army broke into its component parts again, and each army took a section of the high, ancient Roman walls to lay siege to. Godfrey took the north. Bohemond and Tancred set up around the east. Raymond was still dawdling towards Nicaea, but the other two figured he could hold the southern wall when he got there. As for the west, well, one of the key features of Nicaea is that it sits on the lake Ascania. And this is no small lake, it's about 115 square miles. The western wall of Nicaea abuts the lake itself, so the Crusaders figured, well, we don't really need to guard that. And thus, the Crusaders set up around the walls of Nicaea and promptly began to starve. But Bohemond, a seasoned military man, set up a system of naval resupply with the Byzantines. With that handled, the real work of sitting around could get started.
Really? When do you need to be veteran to know that you need a supply line like that to survive? I mean, I've been, reacting to these videos for past year. I've never fought any battle. Anyone I could have told that, like, okay, one of the key features, make sure there is a secure supply line there with Byzantine or something. Damn, this was really chaotic at the
Just
time.
as Raymond finally dawdled into place, the Turks at last arrived. Kilij Arslan, at the head of about 10,000 horse archers, thundered down in the plain surrounding the city. Then he saw just how many Crusaders he was facing, and turned right around and thundered off in the other direction. The Crusaders gave chase.
That is fucking awesome. I'm imagining, him basically arriving there with this kind of epic music playing, 10,000, riding horses, and then saw just how many of the Crusaders are there. 1 second of pause, a cricket sound in the background, and thunder back off with the same kind of epic music.
With their heavy steeds, but as the Turkish horses were faster, the Crusaders inflicted only light casualties on Kilij Arslan's force. Still, they had routed them. The Crusaders celebrated. They held the field, and morale was lifted. It was time to get back to the siege. Now, each of the crusading forces had a different idea on how the siege should go. Some were trying to wait it out. Others were building siege engines. Others were digging under the walls, but none of this seemed to have much effect. Finally, it dawned on them that the western wall on the lake was a little more important than maybe they had first thought. Turns out, the garrison at Nicaea was secretly getting resupplied by boats coming over the lake at night. That kinda threw a wrench in this whole siege plan. The Crusaders didn't have enough.
That's the whole point of having your, I guess, city or whatever at the water's edge, that you can resupply with water pretty efficiently. That's why many, stronghold cities of the past are basically at the edge of water like that.
Forces to guard the entire coast of that enormous lake, and they didn't have a navy of their own to stop the resupply either. But if they didn't somehow prevent supplies from getting into the city, the defenders could practically hold out forever.
Yeah.
So what do? Well, in a feat of logistics that could only be achieved by the heirs of Rome, the Byzantines came to the rescue. They sailed a group of ships to the harbor at Kivito, hauled them out of the water, put them on rollers, and dragged them to Nicaea. The next day, with as much...
Byzantines know, right, how to sail and all the water-related combats, right? I mean, they are great at that, Constantinople, being at the water's edge like that.
Fanfare as possible, the Byzantine ships began an assault from the lake, while the Crusaders assaulted the walls of the city from the shore. And soon, with their resupply cut off and their reinforcements driven back, the people of Nicaea offered to surrender. But here's where it gets complicated, because who do you surrender to? There were basically 5 crusading armies and the Byzantines surrounding the city. To make it even more complicated, the garrison in the city, the only guys with weapons, were all Muslim Turks, while the population of the city, who vastly outnumbered them, were Orthodox Christians who used to be part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Oh, and not to mention the fact that the Sultan's wife and family were still in the city, as was the Sultan's treasury.
How does that work? Holy shit, how does that work? Okay, the Muslims are the one with the weapon and actually has the city, but the city's own population obviously is Christian. How does day-to-day activity work there? How is there not bigger issues? Because when it comes to religion, even simple, simple civilians, peasants, cannot let that shit go. So was there constant revolt there? Because Muslims are the one who's in charge, but most of the population is Christian.
So the negotiations began. But as the Crusaders were negotiating, they were also periodically assaulting the city. During one of those assaults, somehow, magically, the 2,000 Byzantine troops scaled the walls and captured the city, a feat which tens of thousands of Crusaders hadn't been able to achieve. That might seem like an incredible military feat, but remember, this is Emperor Alexius Komnenos we're talking about, and he was always a crafty guy. He knew that if the Crusaders got a hold of Nicaea, they would loot it until it burned to the ground, and then maybe not even give it back to him afterwards.
Okay, here's what I'm thinking. Why is this guy not taking his Byzantine army and marching with the Crusaders? Right? First of all, he's the one who started all this shit because he needs all his territories back. So far, only thing I've noticed that his Byzantine army is stronger than most of this Crusaders army. Because every time there's basically a struggle here and there, Byzantines always kick everybody's ass, right? So clearly his armies is superior. His army is more, I guess, battle combat tactics wise, right? They scale the walls where all those crusaders couldn't. They are clearly better, Byzantines. And, he's the one who started this shit. Why isn't he the one going with them, with the crusaders, right? I mean, he could have easily become the leader of the crusade, right? Because he's the one started it. They needed Byzantine Empire to resupply before going to the crusade, right? He could have easily okay, I'm the one who's going to lead this with all of you with me. He could have easily done that, right? And he's the political guy who basically, bribed the leaders here and there. So he could have bribed them in a way okay, I'm going to lead this crusade. Everybody's going to reap benefits or whatever. He's a crafty guy. I don't know. Why didn't he lead it? I think, he thought the crusade is going to fail miserably. I think that's what he thought. And he just wanted his territory back amongst all the commotion, all the chaos. He just wanted his territory back without losing his army and men. I guess that's what he wanted then. Otherwise, he would have gone with them.
That would not do. So, he had secretly made a deal with basically everybody inside the city to just let him take it. He let the Turks go free, he ensured the safety of the Sultan's family, he brought the people of Nicaea back into the imperial fold, and promised them protection from ransacking. And in return, they just sort of let his troops over the walls. Once the city was firmly in his hands, he let the Crusaders in small groups, and always under guard. But he tried to placate the Crusaders with gifts, to varying degrees of effect. He also tried to get them to reaffirm their oath to him to return Byzantine territory, also with varying degrees of effect.
Yeah, remember guys, this is my city to begin with. Let's not fuck it up, right? Like you've been doing in Hungary and everywhere, right? This is Christian city, my city. All right, let's be friendly here.
And so the Byzantines remained garrisoned in Nicaea, and the Crusaders prepared to press on. But hang on, what exactly was going on with the Turks this whole time? Why hadn't they showed up until it was too late? Where was Kilij Arslan the whole time the crusade was marching on Nicaea? Well, have I got a surprise twist for you. I bet you thought this whole time that whole peasants' crusade thing was useless, perhaps even more than useless. Well, ha! Turns out, by dying so pathetically in such large numbers so quickly, they had convinced Kilij Arslan that the crusading forces were not worth worrying about.
There you go. I was about to say that before, but I didn't pause, since lots of people complain I pause a lot. That all the peasants, like I even said that 2 videos ago, all these peasant, doing all this kind of a weird shit and chaotic thing, that all these Muslim Turks are basically laughing at, they're watching like, okay, these are the people who are about to invade us. And that is what happened. They didn't take this seriously because they thought this is all just, a joke, I guess. All those civilian peasant, barely trying to take over places, can't fight us or something like that. That's what their mentality is, right? So when the real soldiers came, they still took them as those civilians, right? The people who basically led with Peter, I guess the guy was. So, that's why Muslims it's all right. It's not a threat, right? We'll deal with them when they come here. It's not a threat. I think that's what they're thinking.
And so, by heroically being such utter and unmitigated failures, the Peasants' Crusade had lulled the Sultan into thinking he had far more pressing things to deal with than these silly French people who kept showing up on his shores.
Yeah.
Like medieval Europe, the Islamic states were also always involved in minor wars against one another, and the Sunni-Shia split led some in Europe to believe that the Muslim sects were more likely to ally with the Crusaders against one another than actually band together to fight. And when the Crusaders had landed, Kilij Arslan had been off in the eastern part of his realm dealing with border disputes.
Yeah, we saw that in Suleiman the Magnificent video, how even the Christians did that shit, right? There was certain Christians who didn't want to align with Catholics, so they aligned with Ottomans. I'm like, how does that work? Certain Christians hate other type of Christians so much that they're ready to ally themselves with Muslims. Same shit is happening here. Certain Muslims hate other Muslims, so they are ready to ally with Christian states. This is just weird.
From one of the other Islamic states. He had actually been informed of the Crusaders landing almost immediately, but he figured they'd probably bumble themselves to death before he'd even get there,
yeah.
And that his garrisons could deal with whatever trouble they might create anyway. In one of the great ironies of history, if the Peasants' Crusade hadn't expired en masse without doing any real damage, the Prince's Crusade might have been swept back into the sea before it ever had a chance to group up and gather steam. But gather it had, and now the Crusade began to head south. But finding supply too difficult to manage, they split again into 2 forces. A smaller force led by Bohemond and Tancred in the vanguard, and a larger force with Godfrey, Raymond, Stephen, and Hugh behind. After about 4 days' march, as dawn broke and Bohemond's forces began to wake in a small valley outside Deryllium, Turks started to pour out of the surrounding hills. Kilij Arslan was not done yet. The Turks whirled in and out of the camp, slaughtering civilians and unarmored combatants. Individual knights tried to arm and mount amidst the chaos. Those who could tried heroically but futilely, often alone or in small gathered groups, to charge the fluid Turkish line. At last, Bohemond, riding furiously up and down the camp, shouted to his knights to dismount, lock shields, and defend the civilians.
Yeah, so we've seen even in the Japanese video, Sengoku Jidai, what was that? Yeah, the civilian 100-year civil war. I learned one thing, right? I'm learning tactics of war, right? Which things are crucial and which are not by reacting to all these different type of historical videos. One thing I'm, damn certain, doesn't matter how powerful your army is, if, opposing army, even with, I guess, less than 10th of the number of the soldiers that you have, if they suddenly catch you off guard at your camp, right? It's really hard for you to, I guess, come out victorious, even if you outnumber them, 1 to 10. So, being battle ready is extremely important. If somebody just basically surprise attack you where you are at your camp, you're fucked. That's the case here as well, right? This Muslim guy basically came there and saw how many crusaders are there and ran away. But he was basically waiting for a vulnerable moment. When he saw he could surprise attack their camp, he just did, right? And this is difficult. Obviously, veterans like that will form some kind of a strategy to defend, but it's really hard. The losses would be way higher now.
They formed a circle and tried to bring those without protection inside. The Turks rained arrows down on the knights in an unending stream, and yet they stood, stolid and unmoving. In one of the most impressive acts of discipline in all of the Crusades, the knights held their line for hours, never being baited into charging, never breaking formation as men fell from the deadly hail.
But they're knights.
Inside the circle, people screamed as stray arrows made it over the wall of armor and shields and occasionally found their mark.
Don't show me,
then
kids.
The priests inside the circle began to sing, and those nearby began to sing with them. And the sun rose, and the men still held, battered by such mortal rain, baking in the heat of Anatolia, wearing full mail armor under the blistering sun. Then the women began to bring water to the line of knights, risky though it was to try. And still the knights did one of the most difficult things for any army in any time. Simply take fire for hours without moving, without breaking, without ever being able to attack back at their foe. And the line held. Slowly throughout the day, small forces of crusaders arrived. Godfrey, with some 50 knights, abandoned his main force and cut his way to the embattled Bohemond, as did men of Hugh's forces. Then, at last, after 7 straight hours of sun and arrows, Raymond's force arrived and slammed into the Turkish flank, surprising them completely. As he did so, Bohemond and Godfrey ordered the men to remount, abandon the shield wall, and charge the Turkish line, with a mighty cry of, "Today, if God's willing, we'll all be rich!" I'm completely serious. That was the battle cry, just a bit more Latin. Reeling.
Yeah, man, it's about life and death. Let's talk about being rich because that's what people care for. Not about honor, right? Not about writing your name in history. Not about being immortal throughout the history or whatever. No, we're going to be rich. It's all about money.
Ilyich Arslan pulled back to a hilltop to defend. The fighting was fierce until at last, a force led by Bishop Adhemar of all people, snuck around behind the Turks, burned their camp, and charged them from the rear. The Turkish line fell apart, and the way to Antioch was left open to the exhausted crusaders. Join us next time for the March to Antioch, the trials of the desert, and a liberal interpretation of the meaning of oaths.
Now shit is about to pick up, I guess. I love this. This episode was good. Look, I've said this in the, I guess, second part or something. This is the fourth part, second part or something. When I saw that People's Crusade, how fucked up that was. I said it like, all the Muslim states are probably watching that and laughing. Like, are you kidding me? These are the people who are coming to take over Jerusalem. And actually, that is what happened. They saw then like, okay, this is a joke. And they didn't take this Prince's Crusade, the real soldiers' crusade, seriously. Until they're really close now. So, those people, meaninglessly dying there, right, in People's Crusade, was not literally for nothing, right? At least something came out of it, right? At least it gave this people edge here, that they actually came close before, Muslim Turks can actually strategize something. I don't know. Are they going to take the Jerusalem here? I don't know. I guess we'll see. There are still 2 more parts to this. Damn, this is a 6-part series. I'm loving this so far. Alright, people, if you like my Rickson, don't forget to like, subscribe. Check out the Rickson, there's a link in the description. Check out the cast for plays like history, Polish Against Proxon, Internet Historian, different channels there, I guess, to make it easier. Way too many videos on my channel, I guess. So, yeah. And I'll see you next time.